Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Robert Swartwood here. Tonight, I am joined by an award-winning writer of thrillers, crime fiction, and westerns, whose most recent book is The Twilight Town, a Dallas 63 novel. He is also the host of the very popular and much listened to Spies, Lies, and Private Eyes podcast. That's right, it's your favorite writer and mine, Terrence McCauley. Terrence, how the heck are you?
I'm doing all right, pal. Thank you for having me on your show, and it was great having you on mine a while back.
Yes. Well, again, thank you for having me on your podcast. We are going to get into your podcast, talking a little bit earlier about how you are up to 141 episodes so far. I think you just, at least the most recent one, at least I saw on your website, was Karen Slaughter.
Yep, that was this
Um,
week.
so yeah, so 141. Wow. I have no idea how many of these I've done. I honestly, I don't even keep track. I probably should, but I don't even keep track. But let's not talk about this. Let's go back to obviously now the new book is out. If people can want to look here on the screen, if you're watching, you can see in the right hand corner is the Twilight Town. It's a really great cover. This just came out,
Right.
what, like a week or two ago?
It came out last week. Yeah, it did.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
So it
we're
came
of
out
course
in
going
the
to talk
last
about
book.
this, but as usual, I always want to kind of like go much farther back and talk about like kind of well, first of all, so from what I can tell, your very first novel, at least very first published novel, was back
Hmm.
in 2012, and it was called Prohibition. Now, is that your first novel, or just your first published novel?
No, that was my first published novel. My first novel was one that I wrote right after college, called Tenets of Power. And believe it or not, and don't roll your eyes, everybody, it was a mergers and acquisitions thriller. It was not, there was not supposed to be any crime. There wasn't supposed to be any terrorist attacks or guns. What I wanted to do was tell a, like, let's say, Glengarry Glen Ross, David Mamet kind of story, but about mergers and acquisitions. And it was about the drama of companies that buy and sell other companies and betrayal, deep things like that. I wrote it. Took me a long time because I would write on nights and weekends, but I had a very demanding job. And the book wasn't picked up, obviously, because judging by how many people are probably yawning from that synopsis, it didn't really grab people. I didn't get an agent, and I certainly didn't get any attention from publishers. But writing that book was very important because it taught me how to write, and it taught me that I had something to say. So throughout the years immediately following the failure to get that published and get attention for it, I've harvested that story innumerable times for short stories, plots for other books, and things like that. One of the books that wound up benefiting the most from it was my first one that was published, Prohibition. It's set in 1930s New York. It's about an Irish crime boss named Archie Doyle and his right hand man, who is a hitman named Terry Quinn, and Quinn having to use his brain more than his brawn to protect his boss's crumbling empire in 1930s New York City.
Okay. Um, Prior to that, though, so that very first book that you had written, um, prior to that, like, had you done short stories? Where was there anything else creative you had done? I mean, what basically, because I always say, like, it's not easy, obviously, to write a book. A lot of people might think it is, but once
Mm,
you actually sit down to do it, you realize, oh, okay, yeah, this is not easy, especially if you're trying to write a good book. So,
right.
I mean, so what had you done? I mean, do you remember the very first thing you had done, like creatively, whether you were a kid or in high school or anything like that?
Right. Yeah. Well, I wound up taking a creative writing class in college, and I had written a short story based on that mergers and acquisition story I just mentioned to you. And a lot of people in the class liked it. They liked the tension, and they weren't expecting to find that kind of an element in that kind of a dry story. So that was my first foray into formal fiction writing. And before that, I had written in school. I had written some stories in school and elementary school, things like that. And people enjoyed them, but I never thought I was going to be a full time writer. At that point, I was never one of those kids who had his nose in a book. I was always more of a TV and a movie kid. And I especially loved comic books, and my dream was to become a comic book illustrator. But unfortunately, my skills there kind of leveled out. And at 14 or 15, I realized that I wasn't getting much better. So I put my creative pursuits into something else. So I was always thinking of stories, but I didn't really start writing them until college. And that's where I got the bug.
Yeah. Okay, so obviously then you were reading comics. Because I mean, I would say from the bio, thrillers, crime fiction, westerns. Was that the stuff you were reading at the time when you were a kid, or were you reading other stuff? Because sometimes I find writers might get into sci-fi and then they might
Mm-hmm.
transition into a certain genre. Like what were you reading? Like what were you consuming? What type of comic books? Were certain movies, TV? I mean, what was like an inspiration for you?
For me, the comic books I really liked were the ones that I thought I wanted to draw. So it's funny that same advice, write the books that you want to read, or is what I follow now in my writing career. So back then, I used to love Batman, kind of liked Superman, loved Captain America, because those were stories that I could relate to. The ones that I couldn't relate to were the X-Men or Alpha Force, Alpha Flight, sorry, and maybe Fantastic Four, because if it got too beyond the realm of me being able to envision it, even though it was a comic, I kind of lost interest. I couldn't, if I couldn't really grasp it or understand it or see myself doing it, then I didn't really want to read it. In terms of the books I read outside of comic books, I always did very well in English and in composition, but I didn't really like reading at all. I would pick it up quickly. I'd read what I had to, and I'd get away from it. The first book that I really read and enjoyed that gripped me was Taipan by James Clavell. And that was a book that my father had read when I was a kid. I watched him read on his way to and from work every day. And I said, you know what? I'll give that a shot. I read that on my winter break from college, and I was blown away by it. The complexity of stories, the different characters, how each character stood out in my mind. They didn't all run together. And I realized that that was something that I would like to do, since it wasn't going to work out for me as being an illustrator. Maybe it could work out for me as being a writer. And then I read another book right after that, The Day After Midnight by Stephen Hunter, who went on to write the Swagger series of novels. And I had the opportunity to talk to Stephen Hunter about this and thank him for showing me a smaller book that made me realize that I definitely wanted to do this as a career. So I focused on looking at books from then on, not just for entertainment value, but also to see how the author was doing it. And then I always had that in the back of my mind after I graduated college and started a career in New York State government, where I was for 25 years. But then I was writing on nights and weekends, and that's how I got to where I am today.
Yeah. Not to get so much into the weeds, but going back to that story that then you had that very first story in the creative writing class and that then you
Mm-hmm.
expanded into the novel. Do you remember like what was the seed like what was, like what made you want to then spend all that time writing a book based on that idea? Do you remember like what was speaking to you at the time? I mean, because it is an interesting idea. I mean, people have to think about like, there's Glengarry Glen Ross, but did you ever see the movie Margin Call?
Margin Call, Boiler Room, yeah. And
But the thing about Margin Call, at least with Boiler Room, it's been a while, but I feel like that Margin Call essentially is taking place over the course of just one night.
mm-hmm,
And nothing really is happening, but it's very suspenseful. It's just people in rooms talking, and
right,
it's just this sense of dread. Because I mean, on the outside, the audience knows what's going to happen, but
right.
just I don't know. It's very fascinating because yeah, you don't see many thriller books like that. But although I think that it would be interesting to see more that can be done effectively. But yeah, I mean, what exactly was it, Glengarry Glen Ross, that kind of gave you that like inspiration to kind of do something like that?
I hadn't seen Glengarry Glen Ross until after I wrote the book. I didn't have cable in that area of the Bronx where I lived. So, and I didn't see it in the movies because it just didn't appeal to me at the time. The reason why I think with my writing journey, I wanted to tell stories that surprise people with aspects they might not necessarily think about. And when you think about mergers and acquisitions, well, all right, fine, it sounds boring, but there's a lot of drama to it that I wanted to bring out, even though I don't know anything about that world, and I certainly didn't know it as a 19-year-old kid. As a as a political science major at Fordham, I wasn't even in the business program, but I could sense that there was a certain amount of drama there. And there were aspects of betrayal and honesty and dishonesty and skill that people might not expect to find, but that I wanted to tell. So I never really wanted to tell the epic of, let's say at the time it was Raiders of the Lost Ark or Top Gun, but I wanted to tell a story that was just as thrilling, but in a way that might surprise the audience.
Right. And so I think we had this discussion before, so I think I know the answer. But when you are writing, and maybe this has changed since that very first book you wrote, are you one to just kind of sit down with that idea or character in mind, and just go from there, or do you like to have an outline, kind of plot it out at least, for somewhat, or is it like a hybrid of it, or like
Mm-hmm.
typically how's that process work for you?
For me, I spend an awful lot of time thinking about a book before I start it, or a story. And I'm not always sure which one it's going to be. Sometimes it turns out to be a novella, sometimes it turns out to be a short story, and sometimes I'll sit down thinking it'll be one or the other. And next thing I know, I'm 30,000 words into it and it's not done yet. So then I figure, you know what? I've got a novel on my hands. Uh, so I do not outline it per se, but that doesn't mean I just sit down and wing it. I definitely give it an awful lot of thought before I start it. Now, I've also had the good fortune of being asked to be in a couple of anthologies recently. So when I get that idea, when I get that request, if it's a topic that is going to interest me, I'll spend a couple of days thinking about how I want to say it. And then after I've thought about it enough, I sit down and I force myself to bring it into some kind of a shape. So it's not like I can just turn on the switch and it's always there, but my mind's always cooking on something. So if I get some direction, usually I'm able to churn something out in a good amount of time.
Right. So with Prohibition, that was the first one that was published. That's a Charlie Doherty novel. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
it was, yeah. I mean, it wound up being included for public, I would say publishing purposes under as a Charlie Doherty novel. And Charlie Doherty is someone who appears in all of my 1930s fiction, but this book and Against the Ropes were pretty much Terry Quinn novels with Charlie Doherty playing a supporting role.
Was it initially the idea that it was going to be a thriller, or was it more you just wrote it just to write it, and then it turned into the first book in a series?
I thought it was going to stand alone on its own merits because it's very much a book about loyalty and friendship. It was written at a time when a lot of other stories would have, like Road to Perdition, for example, would have the loyal hitman who's ultimately betrayed by the boss that he served so well for so long. And there were also other stories and movies and books that came out where that same idea was portrayed. And I wanted to tell, as I said earlier, I wanted to take a different angle on it. And I wanted to tell a story where there is a flawed protagonist who doesn't necessarily understand everything that's going on, but he's very grateful to the person who helped him and gave him a start in life and who ultimately turned him into a criminal and a killer. But that loyalty still remains in that world. And he does what he can to protect that person who is like a father to him. Uh, Telling that kind of offbeat story really intrigued me because I wanted to get the audience to cheer for someone they wouldn't normally even want to sit next to in a subway or get on the same elevator with. This is a very scary, violent, angry killer, but somehow you're rooting for him. And for me, that kind of being able to make the audience care about somebody like that, that's a thrill.
Yeah. I mean, you've written several different series. So, like, now at this stage in your career, do you like when you are deciding to write, a series, do you usually have a certain number of books in mind that you can maybe at least get out of it? I mean, or is it more of like kind of a, we'll just see, if I get a book deal, like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
if they want to publish 10 books, I'll write 10 books, or like do you sometimes have a certain like arc in mind for some of these characters?
You know what? I've been fortunate enough to be able to write series of different lengths. Usually, if I'll propose a series, I'll have at least three books in mind because people like trilogies. They like, even if it's not a direct trilogy, it's chances are if the book one, two, three and will sell, then you'll get four, five, and six, or at least to four and see what happens. Usually after eight books or four books, publishers start looking at the numbers a little bit more. I saw that certainly with my westerns. But with my Charlie Doherty books, I've had the good fortune to be able to tell a lot of stories that were in that universe, and I've moved back and forth. I've advanced from 1930 all the way up to 33, and then I was able to move back in time to 1927, all to serve the story that I wanted to tell, and keep it within the arc of the other stories in the series. When
Yeah.
I started writing the university series, I figured it was going to be at least one book. But then as I wrote it, I got ideas for the second and third one. And I was able to plot those out as I finished the first one. And that series wound up being four books, with three with one publisher, and then the fourth one with another publisher. And my goal there was to spin it off. The fourth book was supposed to launch a bunch of different characters who could go forward and carry their own books. And I'm still hoping to be able to do that at some point because I've gotten a lot of really good feedback on that series. It's one of my favorites. And then with Dallas 63, I have that in mind as a trilogy. The other two books, the second book is being written now, and then I've got an idea for the third book, but that doesn't mean that I'm done with those characters. I've actually, in the course of all of this, gotten the idea for two separate novels that are related but told in a much different fashion. So the creative process is always there.
Yeah.
It's
And
always
and
working
we're
in the
definitely going to
background.
get to the new book. Before that, though, I want to jump over to the Westerns. So,
Okay.
you've done several Westerns. Can you talk about just like that? I don't necessarily say that transition, but I mean, and it's not really, I think, a huge genre hopping because I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Westerns are just kind of crime, crime thrillers that take place back in the good old days. You know what I mean? Like, so, yeah, like how did that come about with the Western series?
Well, I had published Prohibition, and I had published Slow Burn, which was the second book. It's not a sequel, but it's the second book in that series. And I had just sold Sympathy for the Devil, and my agent at the time said, "Well, do you have anything else that you're working on that we don't have a home for yet?" And I said, "Well, I've got a Western that I wrote a couple of years ago before I had representation. I wrote it basically to get it out of my own mind because it had been rattling around in there for a long time." And I said, "It's on paper, it's on my hard drive, but I doubt you can use it." And he said, "Are you kidding me? A friend of mine is always looking for Westerns. Why don't you send it to me and we'll send it over to him and see if it can find a home?" And that's where the Bullets Fly came from. It was something I wrote entirely on spec. I didn't expect anybody to see it, but out of that conversation over lunch, that's how a whole career in writing westerns was born. So it was sitting on my hard drive. I never thought it'd see the light of day, but writing a western is a little bit more complicated than people think because it's not just, let's say, a Mike Hammer story set in the Old West with horses and hats. It's got to have a certain kind of rhythm, and it has to have certain kinds of themes that that audience is going to accept.
Right.
And doing that research into that was fascinating, and it certainly made me a much better writer than I was beforehand.
Yeah, I don't want to. It might sound disparaging, but like westerns can be very formulaic because there is a formula to a good western.
Right.
So, I mean, how did you approach that? I mean, have you found that? I mean, I clearly, like, were you a fan of western, either novels or movies, prior to writing that book?
One thing about westerns that I found, whether it's movies or books, is that they're usually more of a reflection of the time in which they're created than they are of the time they depict. And if you look back in the 1940s and 50s at movies for westerns, for example, you'll see that they're very patriotic. They're about bravery and the lone hero going out, getting the bad guy, and getting the girl at the end. Then you get into the certain parts of the 60s and 70s, and you see more of a counterculture cowboy story
Yeah,
where
High Noon.
yeah,
John
yeah,
Wayne hated High Noon.
yeah, High Noon. You get, and then you get some of the long riders, and you get Outlaw Josie Wales. You get the rise of the anti-hero, and you get to see that the establishment and the respectable citizens aren't necessarily respectable. The 80s, you didn't see a whole lot of westerns. You had Silverado and Young Guns. I think they were more action films than they were westerns, and they were excellent, but they weren't really traditional westerns. And I think that's because people got away from that traditional mindset, and westerns were replaced by movies like Lethal Weapon and a lot of the action movies that were popular with about Arnold Schwarzenegger and other people. And then in the 90s, you started to see um, more traditional westerns told again like Tombstone, but in that sense, they were more violent and they had to have more to them than just a bunch of sagebrush and horses and bank robberies. You had to have good action. You had to have dynamic characters and memorable lines that modern audiences wanted to see. So when I wrote my books, I decided that I was going to, as I have mentioned here a couple of times, take a new bent on the genre where I didn't want to transcend it, but I definitely wanted to take a different tone. And right off the bat, I write about a black deputy and a white sheriff in rural Montana. And it's them against the world, pretty much. They're trying to stave off criminals, they're trying to stave off modernity and preserve peace in their town. And I figured they're never going to publish it. There's no way they're going to want to have a Western that is this type. And the only thing they told me to take out was the language because it was closer to Deadwood than it was Gunsmoke. And they said, you can't have that much cursing. You can't have that much violence. Still have it. You just got to tone it down a little bit. And those kinds of parameters really help me not only appreciate a new craft, but appreciate a new genre as well.
Sorry, I'm having laptop issues. It's overheating, I think. That's why I have you on mute. So, in case
That's
you see
okay.
that. The yeah, so that's interesting. So so those westerns were published from Pinnacle. So you're saying that and that is a thing really when you're doing more, I think, more mass writing, that idea where, like you read a David Baldacci novel or a Lee Child novel,
Right.
you find very few F words because there's inevitably always going to be, that one-star review on Amazon that's always like, oh, this was a good book if it wasn't for, the F
Yeah.
words. And so that's kind of something to, and I've always found like a lot of those writers who become very popular, their earlier books will have, a lot of F words, they'll have a lot of violence. And then as they become much more popular, they start to kind of, wean that back a little bit. So I don't know if that's, yeah, like you said, that's something that I guess I mean, do you kind of keep that in mind then for like the books then moving forward?
Well, you have to, if you're going to write in a genre, you have to respect certain aspects of it as long as they don't completely cripple the story. So with Westerns, there's, especially mine, it's okay if you have cursing, but the, it's, I learned that words like the F word and words like a hole hit different in dialogue than they do on the page. And people who hear that or in a movie are probably going to glance over it a little bit more than they will if they see it written. And for me, if it gets in the way of telling the story, then it has to go. And that's whether it's a gratuitous action scene or excess dialogue or cursing. I think also too, people are worn out with cursing because the people writing scripts today don't know how to curse. I mean, they just dump the F word and everywhere, and it. I'm certainly not a prude. I grew up cursing. My grandmother cursed, for God's sake, but it's just if there's too much of it, it becomes a distraction, and I'm very conscious of that when it's on the printed page. So if it serves the purpose and you sprinkle it in, it's like exclamation points in my view. Too many of them will spoil it, but just enough will get the point across. So for Westerns, it's the same thing. And there's also plenty of other ways you can fill up the page too. There are details that you have to take into account when telling a story set in the 1880s. There's horses and travel time and the different type of tech that they had back then, which encompasses the way they built their wagons, the kind of armaments they had, what they had to contend with the rain and sickness and things like that. So when I'm writing a Western, there's a lot more I can put in there than just curse words for shock value or because I'm looking to get a point across. There are other ways of doing that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'd say that makes sense. I mean, just like I think with any type of story or novel, you always have to ask yourself, if it's needed. So even like with the cursing, the same thing applies to like, are these particular characters needed? Is a certain setting needed? So, so I mean, how much research then are you doing? Especially with these westerns or these stories that are set back in the 30s, or even the one that we'll be talking about tonight, the one back in, in the 60s. I mean, are you like do you let the research get in the way of the story, or do you, whereas opposed to sometimes I feel like a lot of writers, they do a lot of research where there's nothing wrong with that, but then I feel like they spend all that time doing research where they want to make sure they include all that research into the book where it doesn't
Right.
necessarily need all that, so like I mean, how do you kind of balance that?
It's knowing, and you said we can curse, so I will use my full range of expression. It's about knowing when to shit and get off the pot. That is exactly what it is. I find useful when it comes to research with the westerns. I made sure that my armaments and the weapons that I used were time accurate because if you get that wrong, that audience will crucify you. And I think they have every single right to do it because it keeps us honest. And the kind of weapon, even if you're off by 6 months, makes a difference. And it also helps make the story a little bit richer. When I was, and also knowing the parts of a horse, the parts of a saddle, the parts of a wagon, you'd be shocked by how many different parts of all of those things there are. But adding them in to a story makes it a lot more entertaining for me to write because it means I'm getting closer to authenticity. Also, whenever I'm writing in a period, I always try to think about how the people really lived back then, and not just the way they were dressed or how they spoke, but what was going on at that time, and what how had they been shaped by what they are doing at the time of my story. So people who were in the West in the 1880s, there were a lot of them were new arrivals to that area. They overcame a lot to get there. And that saga and that trek shaped who they are and gave them a little bit more grit than you might think. Um, when I was doing my 1930s stories set in New York, completely different, but setting is important. And I didn't want to tell a story that just was a retread of The Thin Man or a Cagney movie. I didn't want another gangster film with hats and gats. I wanted to tell a story about the people who were there so the audience would be invested in them. So that meant I had to meld my love of history and my love of New York City politics and my love of the city's history together to tell a compelling tale set in 1930s New York. that was a labor of love for me because I got more inspiration from what I learned actually happened than what I thought happened. I mean, people have absolutely no idea the stuff people got away with in New York City back then in the 20s and 30s. The movies didn't even cover it. It was they couldn't because the censors wouldn't let them make a movie like that. It was absolutely out of control, and I used a lot of that as fodder in my stories about that era. And just like when I was doing the university series later, I looked up what near technology was, made some logical leaps, and included some things I knew about government and the way people worked and crafted a 4 book series about it. So once you understand the world that you're talking about, whether it's 1880s Montana or modern day, it makes the story a lot more entertaining for me, the writer and the reader as well.
Yeah, so before we get to the Twilight Town, Chicago 63 came out like a year or two
Mm-hmm.
prior. Are these, I mean, this is Twilight Town's a Dallas 63 now. Like, are these connected or are they just coincidental that they're in 63? Or like, I
No,
guess, can you talk about Chicago 63 first, and then we can talk about the Twilight Town?
sure, that's easy to do. Chicago 63 was born out of Dallas 63, the Twilight Town. I had known that I wanted to tell a detailed story about the Kennedy assassination, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And in the course of that research for the Twilight Town, I uncovered stories about the first assassination attempt against Kennedy, and that was 2 weeks before Dallas in early November of 1963, and it was supposed to take place in Chicago. I fictionalized the entire account. It was actually uncovered in real life by the first African American Secret Service agent, Abraham Bolden. In my book, he's Golden. His last name is Golden, but in reality, his name is Abraham Bolden. And he uncovered a plot to shoot President Kennedy as he attended the Army Air Force football game at Soldier Field one Saturday afternoon. And he was going to land at the O'Hare Airport, drive through the city, take a slow turn off the freeway onto a city street, past a warehouse where he was supposed to be shot by a lone gunman, and then continue on to the football game. My book talks about the agents who foiled that plot, and one of the characters, Dan Wilson, does make an appearance in this book because his snitch tells Golden about what's planned in Chicago, and that snitch is Lee Harvey Oswald. So, so that was an example of a book, a novella that was in this book already. And I said, you know what? I love this character, but he disappears after this part of the book. And I really don't want that to happen, but I don't have a good excuse to keep him around. So it would have been like shoehorning him in there. And I thought he deserved better than that. A friend of mine came to me with the idea of doing a novella, and that's where Chicago 63 was born. I took it right out of the Twilight Town and put it in its own work.
Okay, so and Chicago 63 came out last year, correct?
Yes, yes, that was with Silverback Publishing with the people at Best Thriller Books.
Best seller books. So how long had you been working on? I mean, I guess like yeah, like when did this idea for then Twilight Town come to you, and like, when did you start drafting that?
I started drafting that about 2 or 3 years ago when I found a couple of new documentary series on YouTube. One of them was America's Untold Stories. I don't know if you've seen it. It stars Mark Robert, and he does a lot of research into the Kennedy assassination, and he'll take various people and speak about them for 2 hours with his co-host Eric Hunley. And it's you'd think the two guys sitting there talking about the JFK assassination would be boring, but these guys make it entertaining because especially Mark, he'll tell a story and it makes it engaging. And they'll have some visual aids, but when you realize the secondary people who were involved in this, that made me Google people and look into, did this really happen this way? And the more I did that, the more of an idea of a story was born. And that's where the idea of a trilogy came from.
Yeah, so the trilogy, so now again, you do not outline, you said, but you do think about it for a while. So initially, did you like, you had the idea, okay, this is going to be book one, and again, you even said from this, the novella
Mm-hmm.
kind of grew from these characters. So, um, kind of actually, I'm going to go a completely different direction. When you're usually writing a book, like how many drafts do you go through? I mean, are you somebody who likes to do kind of the Nora Roberts vomit draft, where you just want to get that initial first draft out, or are you sitting down and kind of like rereading what you wrote the previous day and kind of like editing as you go along, so that when you have your quote unquote first draft, it's essentially pretty clean? I mean, like how often? How many drafts do you typically have until you have what you feel is a solid draft to kind of go to an editor or agent or whoever?
For me, the first draft is always just getting it down so I know what I have, if I have anything at all. And that's why when I cut through the very first draft of the Twilight Town, I didn't even have a title for it. But I realized that once I saw it all in full, that the Chicago part of it was great, but it didn't really fit. And I did so much in creating a really cool character in Abraham Golden that it didn't do him service to introduce him and then he disappears. But it also would have hurt the book to keep it. So I took that out, and I wouldn't have known that if I had kept going along and editing as I was writing it, because I would have been too close to it. So for me, it's getting the book finished, getting it out, getting it on paper, and then I'll go through and review. And on that second review, that's when I'll remember how it ended, what happens next, and then I go through it and I'll make sure that things are threaded properly. I see what's working and what isn't. I don't spend too much time between drafts, by the way. If I finish the book on a Friday, Monday, I'm right back at it, starting from page one and carrying through until I'm done. And then usually by the third or fourth draft, I'll have it ready where I feel it's good enough for my wife reader to read and or an agent or editor.
Do you, when you're working on like a book that's going to be a series, do you do a good job of kind of keeping a list of characters and like secondary, tertiary characters? Or is it one of those things where you then get to the next book and you're like, shit, I have to
Eh,
go back and you know what I mean? Like, because I don't know, I just feel like writers who are a little bit, I don't know, more. I guess it's maybe part of the brain. I don't know about you, but usually, like, I will oftentimes start out trying to keep a character list, but then trying to
right.
maintain that character list as I'm going through the book can be difficult because I just focusing on the actual what's on the page, and then not, I don't know, like, how's that work for you, especially for books where you have several different books then ongoing in a series.
Right. The thing that works for me is as I'm writing at the very bottom of the page, I will have a list of characters that I know are going to be in this. If it's a series, for example, and if they're characters that pop up, I'll know either as I'm writing them or at the end of the book. I'll keep populating that list, and it's literally right at the bottom of the page. And I copy paste, and then I go right back to where I'm writing. So by the end, I have a list of characters that I can keep track of. For me, that works, especially if I'm working on a series where I'm not going from, let's say, book three right into book four. Let's say I'm going from book three of a Western to book two of a spy thriller. Then I have to make sure I refer to those lists of characters that are at the bottom of the previous manuscript. And then I get reminded who died, who didn't. I keep track of them as I write it. And for me, that really helps me not get lost where I figure, who did this? Did he live in the last one? Did he die in this one? What did he do then? Little notes like that really help keep everything in track for me. And I did that certainly with the Twilight Town. I'd keep a list at the very bottom, who did what, who they were allied with. And like I said, it's just one line, but it really helps keep everything in track. It's quick and dirty and works for me.
So that's fascinating. So are you using like Microsoft Word, or like what do you specifically use? So in Microsoft Word,
Yeah.
you're doing chapter one, chapter two, chapter three, and then but like you have an extra page or whatever where you're just keeping all of that. So it's not like in like a separate document. It's all within the
No,
same document. So if need, oh yeah, that's great. Because I
it's
mean, it's
yeah.
just you just easily can just like go there. You don't have to like pull open something else, and
No.
oh yeah, that's good to know.
And what I do is also, I don't even keep it on a separate page. It'll be, if I, because for me my eyes are not great, so I'll zoom in to, I think it's 200 zoom on Word Perfect. God, I'm dating myself. Microsoft Word. So it'll be, the names will be just out of my view. So if I'm writing somebody and they come up, I'll say, okay, I'll go down and I'll write their name in, and I go right back up, and it's right on the same page. So sometimes I've made the mistake of sending too many pages to the editor when they're like, why are all these people at the end? But it definitely helps keep everything in order.
Yeah, no, that's good. Thank you for that. That's something to keep in mind. So, all right. So, Chicago 63 says kind of like a fictionalized story about the assassination attempt. So, Twilight Town, is this how true to life are you trying to keep this, or like like are you fictionalizing this? I mean, how much of historic fiction is this? You know what I mean? Like, are you trying to kind
Right.
of stay really close to the truth, or are you kind of, weaving, or like, yeah, I mean, what more can you tell us about this book, and then how it will lead into, basically set up a trilogy for you?
Sure. Well, the biggest thing to remember about all of these books is that this isn't alternate history. So, yes, you do know how the book ends. The first book takes place from February of 1963 all the way through to the afternoon of the assassination, and through the assassination. I write about it in the book. So, yes, you know, Kennedy dies at the end of the first book. But for me, the thrill is telling you how it got there, how we got there, how what the events took place in the lives of three corrupt Dallas police officers, and how they ultimately played a role in that assassination. An unwitting role in some instances, but a role nonetheless. For me, I did a ton of research, and even though I didn't outline, I did a lot. I filled up a lot of yellow pages of notes, yellow notepads, about different sources, different things I had read, people I had uncovered that others had covered too, but I explored in depth. Secondary characters that weren't in the grassy knoll or in Dealey Plaza necessarily, but were involved in some way based on my research. I used that as the basis of how I told the story. So everything that I write is based on some fact that I uncovered. I didn't completely fabricate. I tried to stick close to times. I tried to stick close to known events. I did fictionalize the reasons for certain things. I did fictionalize some actions, but all of the core events about, I mentioned Jack Ruby, I mentioned the real mayor of Dallas, I mentioned the real police chief. J.D. Tippit is one of the three main characters. He was the officer who was killed right after Kennedy on the streets of Dallas the same day. He is one of the characters in the book. And there are others too that I've changed their names, but anybody who knows the events of what happened will recognize who they are. And the reason why I changed their names a little bit was because I didn't want people getting caught up in the detail of what that particular person actually did that day. Just like when I was writing my Westerns, we talked about earlier, I created a fictional town because I didn't want people running around and doing specific research on this town in Montana. Did it have that? Could that have happened then? Here, I knew that if I used too many real names to accomplish a fictional goal, people would have gotten caught up in that detail, and that would have distracted from the story that I wanted to tell. because the Twilight Town and the subsequent books are basically about a crime, a street crime. And I look at it from a hard boiled perspective, and I don't really focus too much on the people in the smoky rooms or the CIA or the FBI plotting to pull down a president. Instead, I think that this was a street crime, and I portray it as such in the book. And that means I have to have a certain tone. That means I have to have a certain liberty to tell that story in that way. And that's what I tried to do.
Yeah, I was talking to Bruce Borges the other
Oh,
week, and
yeah.
he was raving about the book. In fact, let's sell some copies here. So you have a lot of blurbs here. Bruce says the only time I put this book down was to catch my breath. I.S. Barry says a must read for history buffs and anyone looking for a fresh take on an American tragedy. Um, James Grady, James Grady of all people, this novel will blow your mind. Um, and you had Matthew Clemens. This rocket ride reads like Macaulay was an eyewitness to history. And Meg Gardner says gritty and suspenseful. A lot of great blurbs there, even a bunch more. We don't have time to go over them. We're going to be here all night. So, all right. So this is available here in ebook, paperback. Is there going to be an audiobook at some point?
I hope so. The publisher hasn't let me know that, but yeah, I'm definitely hopeful that that's what's going to happen. And then the second book will be out sometime, probably around this time next year.
Yep, that was going to be my next question. When can we expect book two? So, all right. So, yeah, everyone needs to go check out the Twilight Town. Before we go, I do want to talk about the podcast. I mean, you're
Sure.
up to 100, over 140 um, like episodes. So again, it's Spies, Lies, and Private Eyes. This is the podcast that you've been doing now for. Can you talk about like how did this even come about? How did you get into the podcasting space? How have you maintained over 140 episodes? I mean, you've had great guests. We talked about Karen Slaughter. You had Laura Lippman on recently. I mean, yeah, like so clearly this is something that publishers paying attention to. They're like putting
Mhm.
all these best-selling authors on there. So yeah, what can you talk about that? And in a strange way, has that like affected your writing at all, or like how you think about publishing?
It definitely has. It's had a profound impact on me. And again, like the Western publication, it was a happy accident. Uh, Pam Stack has been a wonderful friend of mine. She runs Authors on the Air. She was an early supporter of my stuff when I first published Sympathy for the Devil, and she's been a wonderful personal and professional friend ever since. A couple of years ago, she asked me if I wanted to do a podcast. And as everybody listening to this right now knows, I don't exactly sound like Charles Dance or Benedict Cumberbatch. I don't really have a melodious voice or dulcet tones. I open my mouth and everybody knows I'm from the Bronx, New York, and I wouldn't have it any other way. But she said that, because of my writing style and that I've written in so many different genres, that I might be able to interview other writers in a way that shows the audience more about their craft. And so I agreed to do the podcast, and I figured it would go for maybe 10 episodes or so. And now, as you just said, we're over 140 episodes, and I've gotten some really great guests. And I think the secret to it is that I don't prepare for it. I don't have a list of questions, and I even try not to read the books because I'm more interested in their backgrounds and in what they've done recently and how that affects their work as a writer to show where they've been and where they're going. And that's something that people seem to like to talk about.
Do you, are you, I mean, I'm assuming you're enjoying it. I mean, is there a point though where you kind of feel like, all right, I'm at 300, and maybe I should kind of cool it. I mean, like, do you have, or is this something you just feel like you just want to, continue doing?
I mean, I don't make any money on it. As a matter of fact, it costs me money every episode I do. I don't have a sponsor, so I pay for every episode, and it's money well spent because I've got a great producer, and Authors on the Air is awesome, and I get to talk to some really fascinating people. Right now I haven't really run out of interesting authors to talk to. And I have friends that I've had on 2 or 3 times that are still coming out with some really interesting stuff. There are still authors who've had some measure of success that I enjoy talking to. So for me, I'm going to keep it going for a little while. I love talking to the people. It seems to be making a difference in book sales for them, and it's definitely helped me grow as a writer. Hearing all these different experiences that artists have had. I mean, I got a chance to speak to one of my heroes, as I said earlier, Stephen Hunter, and I also talked to Jonathan Mayberry about writing, and I thought that was going to, I'd be lucky if I got 20 minutes with him. And we wound up talking for over an hour. I got 2 episodes out of that. So, for me, I'm enjoying it just as much as the audience is, and I'm benefiting from it even more than they are.
Yeah, well, with being so that's interesting. So Jonathan Mayberry, because he's more of a horror author. So like, are you into like horror as well? I mean, just based on like the stuff that you've been publishing, it doesn't from the outside one seems as much, but like, so like, are you reading horror? You like, or do you like watching it, or what about, I guess, the Mayberry interview? Because I mean, yeah, no, John's great, but like, what specifically about that really kind of stuck out to you?
Because I wanted to interview him for a couple of reasons. And one is that I think his Joe Ledger books are awesome because they do blend really great action and dynamic characters with that horror genre. And I like people that, I like authors that do try to push their boundaries a little bit. And he never lets himself get stale. I don't know how he keeps coming up with all of these different ideas to keep the Ledger series fresh, but he always manages to do it, and he's having a ball doing it. He's also a writer's writer, and he loves talking about the craft. He reads an awful lot, not just horror. He reads a ton of different stuff, and I think, I know I enjoy talking to people like that. Personally, I do love horror. I haven't really dipped my toe into that pond yet, but I would love to eventually, and someday soon. I'm a huge sucker for zombie stories. Don't ask me why, but I find that a well-told zombie story is a great way to spend a rainy afternoon. And so those are the ones I usually gravitate to. But I appreciate the nuances of other genres that I haven't written in yet. So I do enjoy reading horror, and maybe one day I'll take a stab at it.
Yeah, I mean, so you're clearly very prolific. I mean, how many novels have you published so far?
Under my own name and ghost written 30.
30. How many have you written though?
I've had 30 published. I've written 32.
Oh,
And
that's not bad.
yeah, that's no,
So there's not that many trunk novels. So at this stage in your career though, how do you know? I mean, like I'm sure ideas come to you probably daily, but like how do you know like when it's an idea that you want to spend? I mean, like again, not to get too much in the weeds, and I don't want to spend too much time because we're coming up on the hour, but like how long does it typically take you? Like, are you writing every day? Are you trying to get like so many pages done a day? I mean, what is your what is your writing routine usually like?
for me, if I'm on an assignment, and sometimes, especially the ghostwriting assignments, I didn't have a lot of time for, I can write a novel in 6 weeks from first draft to finished product. That is not recommended. It's possible, but not advisable. It took a lot out of me every time I've done it, and for a week, I wasn't able to write anything, or it wasn't healthy for my creative machinery. For something like Twilight Town, a year is about a healthy amount of time for me, from conception to actually sitting down and getting it done, to having a workable draft. I find that if I allowed too much time to sit with it, one can lose confidence in it. And for me, I like to keep hammering away until I realize, all right, now I've got something. This is worthwhile. I'm not giving up on it. And that keeps, as long as the creative juices are simmering, that means that the story won't get stale until I'm ready to take it out of the oven.
And so are you working on just that one project, or are you juggling other projects as well typically?
Right. Well, I have been juggling a lot of different projects. Like I'd be writing, uh, for example, I was writing westerns when I was also, and then in between westerns, I tackled the Kennedy stuff. Talk about shifting time frames and shifting kinds of stories. But right now, I'm focused on book two in the Dallas '63 trilogy. This one takes place the moment after Oswald is arrested in the Texas theater until he's assassinated by Jack Ruby in the basement of the police headquarters on Sunday. So it's about the efforts of Dan Wilson to try to save him during that time. And we know how it ends, but it's about the trials and tribulations of how we get there that are started in the first book and continue on through the second book. So that's what I'm working on now, and I'm hoping that'll be out by next year, this time.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, the newest book is the Twilight Town. It just came out last week, available in ebook and paperback. Should hopefully be an audio, hopefully at some points in the future. Terrence, if people want to stalk you online, where's the best way to do that?
Unfortunately, I have had a couple of stalkers, and thank God I got shut of them. The best place to find me is on Facebook. I am there quite often, and my website is also the central part of where all my work is. It's www.terrencemccauley. It's two R's and all E's, MCCAULEY.com.
Perfect. And is there anything that you've read recently or watched or anything you would recommend to people?
Yeah, I just watched Untamed on Netflix. That was a pretty interesting. I've got two more episodes to go, and that's been very interesting. And believe it or not, something that's completely out of my usual reading range. There's a British writer called Evelyn Waugh, who was Waugh. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Who wrote a lot of social critiques in the 1930s and 40s in post-world Europe, World War II Europe, and I've been very intrigued by his stories. And I've been on a tear of reading them for the last few months, and it's really interesting to see how he crafts his dialogue and his and how he shows the evolution of the people he portrays. It's been eye opening, and it's a journey I didn't think I'd take, but I'm really enjoying.
Very good. So, once again, the author is Terrence McCauley. Newest book is The Twilight Town. And yeah, thanks for hanging out, Terrence. And
Got it.
we'll see everybody next time. Bye.